Hello, everybody, and welcome to another great episode of My EdTech Live. Thank you so much for joining us on this beautiful day, wherever it is that you're joining us from around the world. Thank you so much for all of your continued support. We appreciate all the likes, the shares, the follows. Thank you so much for engaging with our content. And I want to give a special shout out to our sponsors, EduAid. Thank you so much, EduAid, for believing in our cause and bringing some amazing conversations into the education ed tech space. And ladies and gentlemen, I am excited to be here with you all today. I have two amazing guests. I have Kimberly Becker and Jessica Parker, who are joining me this morning so we can have a great conversation, obviously centered around the work that they are doing, what they're seeing, and just to get a little bit about their perspectives of AI. And of course, that's what we've been talking about throughout some of these episodes here. So I'm really excited. Ladies, how are you all this morning?
Hi, we're good. Right
Excellent.
on
Well, thank
Friday.
you. Thank you so much for making it here today. And before we get started, I would love my audience to know a little bit more about you. So we'll go ahead and start with some brief introductions at what your context is within the ed tech education space, and so I'm really excited. So we'll go ahead and start with Jessica. Jessica, tell us a little bit about yourself and your context in the space.
Sure. Yeah. So I'm Jessica Parker. I'm the co founder and CEO of Moxie. We're an AI ed tech company. We predominantly work with graduate students, postdocs, and faculty. These are all soon to be researchers, students learning how to conduct research, or actual faculty who are currently conducting research and writing grants or publishing. In terms of my background, so I have around 15 years of experience in higher ed. I've been teaching in doctoral programs. I was a research director at Northeastern University. And about 8 years ago, I started an academic consulting company. And so I continue to teach, I continue to consult. So I get to see higher ed from sort of both sides as a faculty member and as a consultant, which definitely informs our work at Moxie.
Excellent. That is wonderful. I love that range of work and that experience. So I'm excited to really get your insights as far as what you're seeing again, obviously in this space. And we work a lot on LinkedIn too as well. So definitely looking forward to that. And Kimberly, can you tell us a little bit about yourself and what the context is within the ed tech space?
Yeah, my name is Kimberly Becker, and I have been either a teacher or a student my whole life until really recently when I co founded Moxie with Jessica. And I've taught at all levels, just about high school, community college, and university. I got my PhD in applied linguistics and technology, which is very related to AI because I studied corpus linguistics. And so I'm quite interested in data sets and, the back end basically of a large language model. I'm very interested in the models themselves and how they work.
Excellent. Well, I'm excited about that too, because that's something too that is of my interest, especially with so much that has transpired since November 2022. And I know for all our audience members, I know you've been getting this type of content since November 2022 when this broke, but I'm really trying to bring in so many people that have different experiences in their fields, and then obviously as AI continues to progress, the work that is being done. And of course, we'll learn a little bit about Moxie too as well. But one of the things that I did want to talk about here is, Kimberly, is about your background in the linguistics that you're talking about and how large language models work. So if you can you just give us, just for any audience members still who may not be familiar, how that works? If you can give us just, the easiest, most simplest definition that you may have as far as how a large language model may work. I know that there's a lot that goes into it, but just for our audience members, K-12 space and all around, something easy that they can understand.
Sure. So, a large language model basically is a big collection of data from the web. So, it includes blogs, websites. It's just a big data set. And machine learning allows the machine to find the patterns, learn the patterns, and then predict what the next word or phrase is going to be from that data set. So, when you interact with a chatbot, it's basically outputting a prediction of what it thinks is the next word and the next word and the next word. And it's quite good at it, as we know, but it's tricky because it's not really thinking or communicating in the way that we think of. So the verbs we have to describe output are a little bit deceiving because it's not what's going on. Really, it's just a predictive mathematical model of communication.
Excellent. And I love that definition. And again, just because of so much of the hype that we hear, like you said, I think a lot of the way that we describe AI, or that AI is being described by a lot of people, there's this notion and misconception of like, oh, this thing is thinking, and it's, it's something that is live. It's almost like it's like a brain that is just everything everybody's connected to, and that they're getting the most accurate answers. And I know that it sounds very confident, or I should say the output that it gives looks and reads very confidently, but like you mentioned, it is doing a lot of the predicting and aspects of it. Now, one of the things too is that I'm a big fan of Dr. Emily Bender too, and the work that she's put out. And then I know I saw some posts that you put out too as well recently. Like I think it was either yesterday too as well, where you put out a graph and talking about those large language models and so on. So can you tell us a little bit more just as far as some of the research that you have seen and some of the things that may have maybe a couple of bullet points, positives and maybe negatives within the space for, I guess, education and how this can affect it?
Jessica, do you want to take this one?
Yeah. So there's a lot to unpack there. I'm going to just talk about a few things that are top of mind. So we're spending a lot of time right now unpacking how AI detectors work. I think it's an interesting topic because they're out there. People use them. There's press releases showing the uptick in the use of AI detectors. I know Turnitin put out a press release stating that, that their AI content detector had been, searched over 200 million papers by now, and 20% of them were found to be AI content, AI generated. And when we think about how an AI detector works, it uses a large language model. So it's the same concept as what Kimberly described. It's predicting the next word. It's a mathematical model of communication. And so there's this, I think, myth out there that it can detect its own generated text accurately. But at the most basic level, I mean, it's more complex than this. It is still just using a large language model in order to distinguish between human and AI generated text. But because large language models the input is human generated text, it's taking stuff off the internet that humans have produced and written over time. And it's designed to produce human like text. So it's like we're asking it to be able to detect that accurately, and it's just prone to false positives. At the end of the day, it's still using that predictive mechanism that large language models use. And so expecting it to behave accurately is not a good thing to expect. And so when I think about what's happening in the overall higher ed space, I think the use of AI detectors is a sign of low AI literacy. And I think this is a problem across K through 12 and higher ed, where faculty, teachers, students, when they're using these large language models, I don't think that they're intentionally using them inappropriately. I think it's just a sign of low literacy. We haven't really received the professional development that we need to know how to use them. And so when we see people anthropomorphizing them, which we tend to do at Moxie, we call our AI chatbot Moxie. It's challenging because I was just talking to this faculty member at the University of Rhode Island, where Kimberly and I have noticed this too, where people tend to use it, and especially if they're novice users, they'll get that initial output and they might stop. But the real benefit is in that meaning negotiation, that iterative use of the chatbot, just like you would when you communicate with a human. So on one side, when I'm teaching my students, I'm like, I want you to engage in conversation. I want you to have follow-up questions. Just like if you went to a human, you wouldn't ask a question and then walk away. When you get their first response, you would ask follow-up questions. So in some ways, I think anthropomorphizing it is good because it reiterates the true nature of a chatbot, which is that iterative conversation, that meaning negotiation. But then the pitfall of that is this tendency to attribute, thinking to it, that it's actually thinking when it's giving a response, when it's not. So it's like two sides of the same coin. I think other pitfalls that we see are this binary sort of tendency to either ban it or just totally give into it and accept it instead of teaching students how to position it as, say, a collaborator. I think that these one size fits all approaches don't work. And we know that in education as educators, that it depends on the learning outcomes. It depends on what are we actually assessing. And so it goes back to this larger field of study that's evolving around assessment, which is painful to have to rethink how we're designing our assessments and what are we actually measuring. It's forcing us to rethink all that. So just some of the advice that I give faculty I talk to is resist the urge to take this binary response, become a super user yourself. And then at the end of the day, you're an educator, you know that it comes back to the learning outcomes. So how can you use it to help students achieve those outcomes? Or how do you tell them to not use it because you're worried about it prohibiting learning for that specific outcome? Sorry, that was a
Excellent.
long-winded answer, but
No, actually that's a great, you definitely unpacked a lot, and especially just, I wouldn't say, I guess maybe not concerns, but I mean, it's just what we're seeing. I mean, obviously there's two sides, and I'm like I said, thanks to Dr. Nika McGee also as well, I always use the term cautious advocate. There's many, people and I really try and remain in the middle, but then all of a sudden you'll see something. Of course, what happened with LAUSD, you see some other things, as far as privacy, or you see, news about entities, the way that they're scraping without giving any knowledge of what they're scraping. And then sometimes you're like, what's going on here? And then obviously that educator side of me, I'm like, wow, this can be so helpful for teachers for some of those menial tasks that they can do. But what I'm very cautious about, though, is working in the K-12 space personally, is obviously the introduction of this with the younger students, with the chatbots and all of that. And especially like you mentioned right now, I think there has not been enough training to appropriately use the tools, because I think in the K-12 space, and I don't know if in the higher ed space you may see this, but usually it's teacher goes to conference, teacher is wowed by shiny new tool that does this, and then immediately just come back with no, letting CTOs know, like, hey, I'm going to be using this AI tool, and really with no regards to terms of service. And then, of course, data, and where's the data stored, and so many questions and so many variables there. And I think what happens is that when I go to LinkedIn, you see so many people that have so many great ideas, or you have states that are coming out with, just great, write-ups for teachers, for educators, and so on, and regulations and policy. But at the end of the day, it's like that kind of stays out there, and then it hasn't quite trickled down and filtered down to the teachers to use the tools appropriately, and really think about, like, is this a healthy way of teaching? Are the students really going to gain from, talking with a chatbot, where maybe a student has to see things differently or be taught differently? And they often talk about personalized learning, but we just see how, Dr. Becker was just saying, how this is statistically just giving you, or, predicting the next best word. And so those are just some of the things that are kind of like a little scary, but I am excited about it because I do use it and see the potential that it has. But just, I guess it's just the terms of service, and of course the safety of that. And I know that it's going to get better, but for now it's just those are the little stumbling blocks that I run into, that I just want to make sure that I have the best answers to, because we all want what's best for our students as well. So, Kimberly, I want to ask you, what are some of the things that you may have seen as far as your experience? What are some of the hesitancies that either professors, or maybe that you hear, or work with, anybody in the K-12 space? What are some of those things that they're hesitant about when talking about AI, or using AI then for themselves or with students?
Mhm. Yeah, well, Jessica touched on this a little bit. We're very much advocates for AI literacy, and we published a white paper with a framework for AI literacy that goes through 3 levels or aspects of what it means to be literate. And we're hoping to continue fleshing that out, that kind of theory around what it means to know how to use it well. And because you have to know how to use it well in order to teach it well. I think the main thing is, and this is why the framework starts with functional AI literacy, which just means you know how to interact with it, you understand what's happening under the hood. You don't have to fully be able to, you know, understand it in a way that like a machine learning engineer would understand it, but you need to understand the predictive technology. So one of the things that I have found people believe is happening is that that the chatbot is somehow going into its data and pulling chunks of text and then displaying them directly from some source that has been harvested from the internet. And that's not what's happening. It's a pattern, and so it's just predicting the next word based on multiple examples of that word in context. It's never taking exact chunks of text and dumping them out for output. And so that's one thing that I think, you know, once you understand how the predictive technology works, and you can, and you do have to at least look at some, I don't know, we have a very easy slide that explains kind of vectoring and what a vector space is and how that works. And then I think people can wrap their heads around it. And then they're like, oh, so it's not actually taking anybody's exact wording. No, it's not. In fact, if it were, then every plagiarism detector would work on AI generated output, right? I mean, that's why we can't detect it in the same way we can detect, you know, plagiarism like turnitin.com has always done. So that's one thing that I think is really important. And then the other thing is just to be critical about it, just to look at it closely and to iterate your interaction with it. People think that it's going to be a quick fix to something, and it's not. You have to try and try again to get the best outcome. And that may mean that it takes actually longer than it would. You know, there's some things that Google search is still better for. And then there's other things that it's not. So a critical approach, not only to the biases, you know, when we think critical, we often think, well, oh, it's going to produce these biases and it's going to enhance those in the real world. And I do think that is a concern. But I think just on a practical level, the first critical aspect of interacting with it has to be iterating on whatever and not just taking it for face value, but, you know, really pushing it to give you more, because that's what it's trained to do. It's trained to sort of please you, or, you know, give you. And that's what people will often text me, just friends who know I'm, you know, interested in Anne. They'd be like, it's so human, it apologized to me, you know, or I said thank you and it said you're welcome. And I'm like, well, of course, because it knows predictively that the phrase that follows thank you is you're welcome. And if you kind of scold it, then it knows to apologize and amend itself in some way. So yeah, it's really interesting how we want to anthropomorphize it, but we can't, because then we lose that critical stance.
Excellent. Yeah. And you know, I like that you mentioned. I think oftentimes my concern is, and because in the very beginning of, you know, trying this out myself, and of course getting replies, and you know, you're getting these responses and you're interacting, it just, what worries me is because obviously the workload, and of course that's a lot of stuff that occurs within, you know, K-12 space. And my biggest fear is that this could turn into just a crutch. Like you said, like immediately it's like, oh, you get the first response, and teachers may take that at face value without just, okay, let me look through this very carefully. Let me just make sure that it works with my content objective, with the goals that I have for class, and so on. And so that's kind of my big concern too. And also because of the knowledge cutoff dates that it may have in many states, like for example, in our state, they have updated what they call the Texas Essentials Knowledge and Skills, you know, or the TEKS in here in Texas. And so a lot of teachers may be under the impression like, well, it should be updated. And so they may go in there, type in, this is what I would need my students to do, or create something that goes along this lesson. And then of course it may not be accurate. So my thing is, like you mentioned, as far as the AI literacy aspect of it, I think it's just getting that information out there in the students' hands, and actually in the teacher's hands, I should say, so they know, like you mentioned in your paper too as well, just understanding, and you mentioned it here earlier, being that co-collaborator, but really working at modifying and prompting correctly to get that output that really lines up. And so I think for a lot of teachers, they may have that misconception of like, hey, once I pop this in and say, hey, 44H, the student will learn how to divide with decimals in this, and then they get that first output, they're like, okay, I'm good to go. Let me go ahead and just give that to my students, or just introduce that to our lesson. So I really like that you did provide, this framework, which I did notice that has been downloaded close to 300 or maybe even more just from the website that you have. And that's wonderful. So we'll link this into the episode show notes too as well, so people can go ahead and read, the white paper that you've provided. And of course, to give us and help us get some better insight. Like I said, working at the district level, I really need to hear what people with your experience all over the world, that have been working, that are immersed in it, to help us make those better decisions and just kind of feel a little bit safer, and tread this landscape very carefully too as well. So I want to ask, because I know in your paper too, you introduced the concept of the post-plagiarism era. So can you tell us a little bit about that? And we'll go ahead and start with Jessica. Tell us a little bit about the post-plagiarism era.
Yeah, so that's based off the work of Sarah Eaton. I believe she's at Calgary University. Is that right? In Canada? Yeah, I think it's Calgary. Hopefully I got that right. But yeah, she wrote a textbook, and post plagiarism is a term that she used. And Kimberly and I really latched onto it because from day one, the term plagiarism comes up quite a bit. And it's like educating folks on, again, if you understand how an LLM works, like Kimberly just said, then you would understand that it's not plagiarizing. It's not pulling a sentence or a phrase from a single source. It's just predicting the next word. So therefore, our definition of plagiarism does not apply when we use large language models to help us with writing tasks. So you can't plagiarize it. First of all, it's not an author. So you're not taking the ideas of a person. You can't cite the LLM and give it attribution as a source. And it's also not plagiarizing from a source. So this definition of plagiarism just doesn't exist in the context of using LLMs. Instead, like for folks who are really in this frame of mind of like, well, how do we address it in terms of if a student is using it in a way that what they're calling is plagiarism? I'm like, well, that falls under just academic honesty and integrity and academic conduct, not the plagiarism policy. So that's one aspect of it. But going back to this idea of being in a post-plagiarism era, as Sarah Eaton says, it's this recognition that we are in this new era where as humans, we are going to be collaborating with AI in a multitude of ways. And so what does that actually look like for our output as humans, whatever that output may be? If it's writing a research paper, if it's developing a course, or writing a LinkedIn post, like these outputs that we typically have that are 100% human generated, now we're collaborating with AI. And so her stance is that these traditional rules of plagiarism no longer apply, that human AI collaboration is going to become the norm, that it's actually going to enhance our creativity. But this all hinges on learning how to use it appropriately and effectively. And what you'll notice is in her framework, and when you hear Kimberly and I talk about AI, is we don't focus on efficiency and speed. And I think that that's a major issue that we have right now is what we're being sold and marketed, what's being marketed to us. I know that Microsoft uses the term teaching speed. And I wrote something about this the other day where it's like, when did speed and efficiency become like so important to us as educators? And so when I think about this idea of human AI collaboration and being in this post-plagiarism era, it's not about producing something faster or more efficiently. I think that we can get to the point where our creativity is enhanced and ultimately our output is higher quality when we're not focused on speed, because often it can take longer to produce something with AI, to truly collaborate it in a way that stays true to your original thoughts and ideas, not passing it off as your own, being transparent and honest about how you used it, puts us into this new era where we're going to start to see a lot more acknowledgement of how AI was used in the writing or the creative process. So it's no longer just acknowledging the human's role in the development of a product. It's also acknowledging what was the role of AI in it. And I think central to this is us developing a better understanding, and I see more researchers focused on this, of Like, what does it look like to truly collaborate with AI? Like, I've seen some studies coming out where they're trying to look at what's happening in the brain in this collaborative process. But I think in a more practical way, it's like, what does human AI collaboration look like for a specific task? Because it's going to look different for a task where writing is being evaluated versus a task where you're creating, a video for a marketing
Mhm.
class. And so I think for educators, that is the level of thinking that's required. It's like, well, what am I teaching? What do I want the students to learn? And what does AI collaboration look like within that context? And how do I reframe this idea of creativity and collaboration, and even plagiarism and academic honesty, based on this sort of expected collaboration that I think we're going to see, at least in the higher ed space?
Yeah.
I think it's more difficult for children where you're thinking about child development
Mhm.
and brain development, but in our space in higher ed, I do think this idea of AI collaboration is very much going to become the norm, and that's really
Mhm.
very this framework is about.
Yeah. No, and I love a lot of things that you said, especially higher ed and myself currently working on my doctorate as well. Believe it or not, I tell people, that I know that, there's two sides. Obviously, in the whether you're in the K-12 space or in the higher ed space, there's always like two sides, like the ones that are for, ones that are against. Luckily for myself, going through, my educational technology, and that's what my doctorate is going to be. And obviously working on AI and actually these episodes, they're all my data sets, all the episodes and interviews, because the discussions and it's data. So I was talking to my professor and he's like, oh yeah, so here's what you can do is just download your transcripts, and then he goes, what you could do is create a PDF, go to this app, get an overarching theme, think about some research questions, and then of course, right. And he's like all pro AI, like, because he understands, in his forward thinking, it's like, hey, the tools are there,
Mhm.
rather than fight against it, then say, okay, how can we leverage that? And especially for myself in going through that process has really helped out to be able to be honestly my collaboration buddy in doing all that and putting my ideas together as I start chapter 1 and chapter 3 and so on. And it's been wonderful to see. Obviously, K-12 space is a little different, obviously, in terms of service, things like that come about. But at some point, at least for the teachers to be able to understand that on their side, because our district keeps like ChatGPT and Claude and access to that for teachers only. So at least for them to be able to experiment, to really see it as a co-collaborator in a lot of the tasks and understanding the way that it really works really helps out a lot. And I think a lot that you shared right now are some great sound bites that I know I can go back and, doing a PD session, be able to help our teachers know what AI is, what it isn't. And then, of course, like Dr. Kimberly was saying, some of the limitations that are there. So, talking or going back to a little bit as far as the limitations, I just wanted to go back to Kimberly. I know on LinkedIn, I believe it was yesterday, that you had posted the new study that reveals the dialect bias in AI language models. Can you tell us a little bit about that bit of research that you found, and of course, some of the implications that it may have moving forward?
Mhm. Yeah, so that study used a sociolinguistic research method to analyze how the AI would predict, like, finishing a sentence if the dialect was standard English versus if it was African American English. And it found that it definitely predicted occupations that were less educated occupations for when they used the African American dialect. It produced occupations, it predicted occupations that did not require a college degree. And I think they pushed it further. I can't remember exactly, but I know they push, you push it and just see like how far the bias, how far they could take the bias. And of course, it every study I've seen where a research question is this output biased? The answer is overwhelmingly yes. And that's, you referred to Emily Bender, and she's one of the first people who raised those ethical concerns about the reinforcement of biases and the propagation of, stereotypes and even falsehoods as truth. So I think, yeah, it's really concerning. And if you're working with students especially young students, I think even beyond the text generation, it becomes very, very obvious when you start generating images. The images, of course, a picture is worth 1,000 words. And so that can be a really good way to introduce students to this concept at any level, but I think especially children, because then you see it immediately. If you say, for example, we did a professional development workshop, and I demonstrated how I asked it to generate an image of a group of CEOs. And the first image was a bunch of skinny, I just say it like it is, a bunch of skinny white people, dressed up in gray and black business suits. And so then I asked it to, hey, let's add some diversity to this group. And it got better, but it was a process. And I show in, the images, and that's easier than asking people to read, because the truth is that it's very covert. And that's what the study that I posted on LinkedIn about yesterday was looking at, was this, the more covert things that you have to really look for, because ultimately these systems will be embedded into human resources, softwares, and they're already accepting CVs, and they're identifying like a short list of people to interview based on keywords in resumes. And so as these technologies become more and more embedded, and sometimes we have less choice whether we're even making a decision to use them or whether it's just automatic, we really need to understand what kinds of biases these are propagating.
Yeah, no, and I agree with you on a lot that you said there because especially like, with some platforms that are out there that do a lot of like text to image, things of that sort. I've had similar experiences with a lot of them, and even the ones that are accessible in the education space. I mean, I went in there and I know that there was a huge video on TikTok that got millions of views where there was a lady that put in, an image of, I think I forget, it was like an ankle bracelet or something like that. And then, of course, the images that came out, and I said, whoa, let me go and try something. So I went to that platform and then I typed in janitor, and I got all, like, for the first 10 pages that I regenerated, it was the same kind of image and, of course, the same type of ethnicity and background. And I'm thinking to myself, wow, and even for myself, when I try and create, and I see a lot of teachers that'll put themselves out there and say like, hey, I created this with something. It's oftentimes very kind of, one of them mentioned, it's like, hey, somebody said like this created me very voluptuous. For myself, when I type in and finding a prompt for myself, when I just put here like Hispanic male, and I put, kind of like chubby. I put chubby, like, I admit it. And then I put with a faux hawk and everything. It always brings up a Hispanic male that is very obese and very overweight, and then it always gives me a goatee, and and that's because I don't put that in the prompt, but it's just kind of interesting to learn about those things, like you mentioned, because I mean, with language and what it's understanding and the output that you're getting is very interesting. So those are, I think, some of the concerns too. Obviously, not just in the K-12 space, but in all spaces, because we're seeing, a lot of that happen. Now, also going back to this, it's very interesting. And I wanted to ask that feedback from you, because I don't know if you have heard, but I know one of the big things this past year in Texas, our state exams, our writing exams, we're starting to grade no longer with, actual human verifiers. I think there's a couple that'll go through that percentage, but a certain percentage will go through these AI, readers that'll go straight through. And my concern was this year when I was talking to our content specialist, I was saying like, hey, did y'all notice anything different? How is this graded? Because since I don't get involved in those conversations because they get more contact and access to TEA, my concern is there some kind of identifier that goes along with this test? Like maybe hopefully not including a name, maybe it's a number, because of the language. Obviously, emergent bilingual students may be rated a lot lower, even though they still meet the requirements of the rubric, but because of that language aspect. And so that was some things that came up. And I know probably those will be some questions that will come up this year as teachers are going through grades, for the state, and as this moves forward. So it's very interesting that you bring this up, because there are some things that, no, obviously there's still a lot of work to be done in that area. So thank you so much for sharing that.
Yeah, I think it's important for leaders to also determine what is an acceptable level of inaccuracy. And that can be a difficult question to ask,
Yeah.
but I was reminded of it. So we have a webinar today that I've been prepping for. And right after Turnitin released its AI writing detector, shortly after Vanderbilt University released a press release saying that they were no longer using it because to them, a 1% inaccuracy rate or error of inaccuracy is too much, because they gave the example of, well, we have around 750,000 papers that will be pushed through this AI writing detector. And if even 1% of them are incorrectly accused of cheating, of generating their content with AI, that's not acceptable to us. And so I think of the example you're giving, if the AI has a 1% rate of inaccuracy, is that acceptable? And for many districts, it might be, when you compare it to how much money they might be saving and where that money can be put elsewhere into the budget. But these are all, I think, challenging decisions that stakeholders are having to make, where they're looking at the decisions in front of them. And also these, companies are doing their own internal research. So you have to question that level of bias. And I would not want to be in that decision-making seat, because I think it's very challenging. So I'm not trying to be critical of that decision, but I think it is something that you just have to ask yourself as a district of, like, what are the pros and cons? What are we potentially losing here by making this decision? And maybe it is worth it. Maybe the benefits outweigh the risks.
Excellent. Thank you so much. Well, as we kind of start wrapping up, I do want to give you an opportunity to share some of the work that you're doing through Moxie. So we'll go ahead and start. Jessica, if you want to tell us a little bit of background, how Moxie started, the services that are being offered, and how people may contact you, to be able to, get some consultations or, maybe collaborate with you. So tell us about Moxie and Moxie's vision.
Yeah. So Kimberly and I were previously working on another business. We were working on a virtual academic writing center. And we were running into a lot of the same problems that our university partners were having around why their brick and mortar writing center wasn't working. We tried to solve that with a virtual writing center. And we were kind of in the midst of trying to figure that out, because we were truly solving a problem, but we couldn't scale the solution. So we were in the midst of that when we started using ChatGPT-3, and we did our first study together. We looked at how well it performed in terms of automated writing evaluation. We were particularly interested in how it could be used for formative feedback on academic writing, because that's exactly what we were doing with humans at the Writing Center. And we immediately saw its potential and published that study. And that's kind of how Moxie was born, was in the midst of that. And it goes back to our philosophy, where just because tech can do something doesn't mean that you use it. So our framework is, if the solution to a problem cannot be humanly scaled, then that's a good opportunity to think about technology solving that problem. And so we had the problem of really formative feedback on academic writing in this virtual writing center, and saw the potential for generative AI to be a scalable solution. So we started building formative feedback tools on various aspects of academic writing. I started using them with my doc students in our academic writing course, got great feedback. We continued our research, and then we expanded our tools to include research tools to help researchers make decisions around research design, data analysis plans, ethical considerations. So all of Moxie's tools are designed to provide guidance and feedback, not to generate the work for you. So not to write your data collection plan or write your methods chapter, but rather to act as a collaborator. And so Kimberly and I infused all of our domain expertise into the development of those tools. And right now we've had around 4,000 users this year, and we're partnering with multiple universities to pilot our tools with their doctoral students. So that's kind of what's happening right now and how we got here.
Excellent. Kimberly, so tell me a little bit about that journey too as well. What are some of the exciting things that you're seeing? I know you just mentioned that you'd be partnering with universities, but tell me a little bit about on your side, with Moxie and the work that you're doing.
Yeah. Well, one of the most interesting things that I think we've noticed in partnering with universities and in building these tools ourselves, that is, the importance of a rubric and the importance of the clarity and the robustness of that rubric to really flesh out what you're looking for. And so through telling a machine what to look for and how to give feedback, you have to know exactly what's this going to look like on the back end, and how is the machine, once the student puts in what they have written, how will the machine identify in that writing if it's meeting a goal or not, if it's achieving the outcome or not. And so one thing that we found is that this is a great way to improve your rubric, because it's like giving the instructions of your rubric to the machine to see if the machine can then interpret and apply it. And it's been fascinating just to see how much better our rubrics have gotten, and our understanding of what we're really looking for, because then we can translate that into the teaching, right? Like, how do we tell a student what good writing looks like, and how does good writing accomplish the communicative goals that we're looking to achieve there? So it's really given us a lot more understanding about the language. I mean, for me, I'm always looking at the language. And so that really was a surprise. We didn't expect that. And that's something that I'm really curious about.
That's excellent. Well, thank you so much, ladies. It's been wonderful to have you here today and just share a little bit about not only yourselves, the work that you're doing, your insights. As like I said, one of the things that I love doing about this show is not only amplifying the voices of all my guests and the work that they're doing, but also just to contribute to just the education space with these conversations. And so everybody from K all the way to higher ed, that is curious about AI or this section or maybe this particular, subject that we're talking about today can just get some information there and just roll with it. The more knowledge that we have, the better decisions that can be made. So thank you so much. And before we end, I always love to end the show with the following three questions, just a kind of little lighthearted way of ending the show. And I know I put those on the calendar invite, but just in case, we'll kind of take it. So we'll start with Kimberly first. So my question to you, Kimberly, is we know that every superhero has a weakness or a pain point. Okay. So, so I want to ask you, in the current state, and I want to say maybe education altogether, K through, higher ed. At this point in time, what would be your biggest education pain point, or I like to call it the EduKryptonite?
Mm. Well, for me, so, one thing I've noticed about what other people do when they use an AI is that they sort of stop after they get the initial output. They think, well, it did its job and now I have the answer. And so, but for me, the kryptonite is like, I can ask it again to improve that. And then I get into this loop of like never ending wordsmithing and improvement seeking and optimization. And it's maddening, because a lot of times done is good enough. And that is, so it's just a loop my brain gets into, and it does not serve me well. Um,
All right. Good point. I like that. Jessica, how about yourself?
Oh gosh, kryptonite. I I don't know. I keep going to the positives. In terms of like kryptonite, I think about, I don't know, I'm similar to Kimberly. I'm a perfectionist and I tend to wordsmith. And so on one side, the way I use AI is in a good way. I overcome writer's block. So I don't have writer's block anymore. But then I sort of make up for that time that I would normally be stuck staring at a page, perfecting the output. And so it's like I'm shifting that time in the beginning to time in revision, which I don't think is a bad thing. But I do think it sort of pushes against this misconception that anytime you use AI, it's going to make you more efficient. I don't think that. I think it can lead to inefficiencies, But I think the reality is our time is just shifting. So like not falling into that planning fallacy of I'm going to do this faster this time.
Excellent. Great. And I'm with you on that, ladies. Since November 2022, it's just that you're absolutely right. You just kind of shifted. Now it's like, no, I gotta keep working on it. And so that's one of the things that I started learning too, is that it's you can be efficient, but then there's that point of diminishing returns where I'm continually trying to perfect and work and so on. And then it's like, sometimes good is already done, or like I think that's something that you mentioned. So yeah, definitely getting caught in that. All right, now we'll start with you, Jessica, first. I want to ask you, what is one book that you think should be mandatory for everybody to read?
Ooh, The Alchemist.
Okay.
Yeah. The Alchemist.
Excellent.
It's an allegory. It's a story about finding your purpose. And it's a short read. I probably read it 2 or 3 times a year. It's really easy to read. So The Alchemist. Yeah.
Excellent. There you go. Great insight. All right. And Kimberly, how about yourself?
Well, can I give one fiction and one nonfiction?
Yes, by all means. Go ahead.
Okay. Now I have to complicate everything. Well, the nonfiction book that has most affected me is Atomic Habits, learning how to set little goals throughout a day so that, things add up over time. And I really, that's how I finished my dissertation, was 30 minutes a day. And I never would have believed that I could do it. And the fiction book that I think everyone should read is called The Poisonwood Bible by Barbara Kingsolver. It's my favorite novel.
Excellent. All right. So great choices there. So for all our audience members listening, make sure that you check out those reads too. And the last question, we'll start with you, Kimberly, and we'll end with Jessica. If you can try out a job for a day to see if you like it, which job would you choose?
Oh, it's really hard. I love plants, and I would love to be a botanist. I love to read about plant theories. I just learned about this thing called the root to shoot ratio that I got really excited about. Yeah, I think some sort of botany, or maybe just working in a landscape. Yeah, like a garden. Yeah, like a garden center. I mean, not like Costco, like
There you go.
high-end garden.
There you go. I like it. Like, yeah, here in our area in deep South Texas, we have these, they call them just nurseries. And I mean, so much lush greenery there. And it's so beautiful. And it's way better than what you'd be able to find, at the bigger stores that are around here. But it's just beautiful. And it's just so nice. So yeah, I could definitely see that. That's wonderful. All right, Jessica, how about yourself? What would be one job that you would love to try out to see if you like?
Well, I've been saying for a few years now that I really want a farm, but I feel like I should probably work on a farm for a few days to make sure that I'm up for it. I really just want animals. So maybe I should just go into a vet office or something. But yeah, I want some land with some pigs and cows and goats and chickens. So maybe I should work on a farm for a few days to test drive that.
There you go. I love it. Just kind of breaking up the routine and going to try things out and everything. That's wonderful. Well, this has been a wonderful conversation. Thank you so much for joining me this morning and sharing a little bit about yourselves and about the work that you're doing with Moxie. And for all our audience members, please make sure that you check out the show notes so you can go ahead and connect with Kimberly and Jessica and learn a little bit more about Moxie. We really appreciate all of your support. Thank you all for listening. Please make sure that if you're not following us on all socials yet, make sure that you go ahead and follow us at My EdTech Life. Jump over to our YouTube channel, give us a thumbs up, and subscribe to our channel. Thank you so much as always. And again, my friends, until next time, don't forget, stay techie.